Croeso bawb, and welcome to this recording of our online event on adaptive teaching. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we're going to be talking about the practical aspects of adaptive teaching and some of the principles behind it, in the hope that when we are using some of these strategies, we're thinking about it in a purposeful and purpose-driven way. My name is Bethan Grace Thomas, and I'm an Associate Advisor for Curriculum, Teaching and Assessment, and I'm going to be taking you through the session today. So, our session aims are to know the rationale and benefits of adaptive teaching. We know that there's a strong research base that supports adaptive teaching, but we also know that there are a whole host of ways in which this can be implemented in schools, and some are more effective than others. So hopefully we'll be able to talk about and address some of those today. We'll be able to consider what adaptive teaching can look like in classroom practice, and that practice is hugely important. Adaptive teaching is something that is often spoken about at quite a high strategic level, but we need to understand what that actually looks like day to day in the classroom. And that leads us on to receiving a range of strategies to consider and apply in your setting. So, the first thing that I'd like you to do is just pause the video for a moment and ask yourself, what does adaptive teaching mean to you? And I mean everything. All the strategies that you think have worked very well, something that just makes you roll your eyes, and everything in between. So pause just for a minute and have a think. All right, so maybe some of these things are things that you thought about in that pause for thought. And what we really want to do is start out by addressing some of the misconceptions around adaptive teaching, so that we can then approach some of the new strategies with a shared understanding of what adaptive teaching is and what it isn't. So adaptive teaching is not colour-coded worksheets, or indeed colour-coded resources, categorised resources, numbered labelled resources of any description. And to extend that, it's also not any kind of categorizing of learning intention or learning objective. So thinking about must, should, could, bronze, silver, gold, different colors, chili challenge, anything that places learners into discrete brackets and therefore arguably places a ceiling on learners. And usually we see that in groups of 3, but sometimes it's, even 4 or 5 different categories. We're not talking about adaptive teaching being that at all. Learning styles is not adaptive teaching. Now, there's a strong amount of research that suggests that learning styles do not have any impact on learning outcomes, and are kind of a myth in the system. Learners will probably have a preferred style of learning, but that doesn't mean they learn better in that style. It just means that they like it, in the same way that if we give out information to 100 different people, some of them will like to write it down in a list, and some of them will like to use a mind map, and some of them will like to use a graphic organizer or whatever else. So even though learners have preferred learning styles, actually research shows that using a range of learning styles for all learners, so having tasks that involve visual stimuli, having tasks that involve them doing some extended writing, having tasks that involve problem solving and real world application, using all of those different styles actually leads to deeper learning and deeper understanding. So learning styles and adapting your teaching for specific preferred learning styles for learners is not something that is backed by the evidence. Adaptive teaching is not lots of extra admin and work. And that's why, really, the 3 points above that are myths in the system, because all of those things involve a huge amount of extra work from teachers, and adaptive teaching shouldn't be extra admin and work for teachers. If it is, then that implementation or the expectations being placed on teachers are perhaps misplaced. When we think about adaptive teaching, we're actually trying to think about reducing workload for teachers compared to a perhaps old school style of differentiation. So when we're talking about adaptive teaching, the aim is to have maximum impact with minimum impact on workload. That doesn't mean that there won't be perhaps an increase in mental workload when there's a bit of a learning curve, when learning new strategies and things like that. But longer term, we're talking about reducing or maintaining workload overall. And then finally, fully reliant on written scaffolding. Again, we see this a lot in literature around adaptive teaching and in practice, that adaptive teaching tends to morph into lots and lots and lots of extra written resources. And differentiation certainly went down that route as well. And one of the reasons why adaptive teaching has kind of become the new way of talking about differentiation is because differentiation went so far down that route that it morphed into this workload nightmare where differentiation was expected for lots of different categories of learners, and further personalization was needed, but everything was written and recorded, and that just is not sustainable for teachers. And the word differentiation in educational conversation became so loaded with that idea that the idea of adaptive teaching has now kind of come in to replace that mindset with a new mindset. So when we're thinking about adaptive teaching, we're not thinking about purely written resources and written scaffolding. And again, the strategies that we talk about later on will hopefully highlight some alternatives that you can use. Now let's talk about what adaptive teaching does include. So it includes conscious curriculum planning. Quite often in the day-to-day of teaching, we forget about our midterm curriculum plan. And that conscious planning is really important because it shows longer term how we can be adapting our learning pathways for learners, and addressing any potential misconceptions that they may have. Flexible grouping. There is nothing wrong with categorizing or grouping learners where it's appropriate. The important thing is the narrative around that. So the idea of flexibility. If you categorize learners into the red, yellow, green, and blue table, then that's not fixed for the year. It's not fixed for the next 6 weeks. That could change depending on learner progress, learner performance. And that flexibility needs to kind of extend to everything. And that's the really big kind of hallmark of adaptive teaching, is that idea of flexibility and the understanding that just because a child is a really high attainer in one particular activity, that doesn't mean they'll be a high attainer for the rest of the year. And to maintain that challenge for them, and then support them if they start struggling with something. And that then also extends to learners who are struggling. They may struggle in one topic and then they may absolutely fly in another. So again, that flexible grouping. Continually checking for learner understanding, for student understanding. This is such a simple thing to do, but has such a large impact on so many aspects of teaching. It is an absolute goldmine for effective pedagogy. Because if we are checking for our learners' understanding, it is the first line of defense against that horrible sinking feeling where you take in books after a couple of weeks if you're in secondary, or you take in books after a couple of days of primary, and you're seeing the work that has been done does not match what you hoped or expected for that child. So that checking for understanding within the lesson catches those children and those misconceptions and those anomalies before an extensive piece of work is done, and that misconception's either been embedded or they just worked really hard on something and they're going to be really disheartened when they get it back and it's all wrong. So that continually checking for student understanding is so key, and it's really easy to do as well. Questioning is one of the most effective ways to do this, and once you've built up your repertoire of questions, and you've built up a knowledge of what questions are appropriate where and what the functions are of which different question, then it actually doesn't require a huge amount of planning either. So that for me is a hugely important part of adaptive teaching. Modifying instructional methods and resources. This feels like a workload nightmare, but it's absolutely not. When we talk about modifying instructional methods and resources, we're talking about maybe changing up our explanations, using different models with an understanding of what common misconceptions may come up in a topic. When we're talking about modifying resources, now this might be because of a very specific need in your class, and a particular child may need something very specific. That's sort of separate to this, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We're talking about some of the minor adaptations that we can make that will potentially benefit all learners. Some learners will use those things more than others. So things like writing frames can be really useful. Not all learners will necessarily want to use them, but they're there for those who need to use them. Sentence starters. Um, if you so say if you taught a lesson and you found that learners were really struggling with formatting a formal letter, then you might change up the resource to include the layout kind of in boxes. So this is again almost being both proactive and reactive really to learners and how they work based on your understanding of common misconceptions, but also the misconceptions of the children in front of you. And also when we talk about resources, teachers themselves are a learning resource. So when we talk about the resources that we're using, it can again be the way that we're modeling something, the way that we explain something. It doesn't always have to be that written scaffolding. Designing enriching extension activities, hugely valuable, hugely important. When we talk about adaptive teaching, quite often the assumption is that we're talking about just our lower attainers. We're not, we're talking about our higher attaining learners as well. Enriching extension activities are really important. We don't just want to be giving learners busy work when they're finished with a main task. We want learners to be deepening that learning. So it could be them connecting that learning to other learning in the planned curriculum. It could be them doing some independent work, connecting it to an area of interest of their choice. It could be them deepening their understanding through a question that has no right answer. And those sorts of questions can be really valuable for higher attainers because they're quite used to getting things right. So the idea of thinking and valuing the process of that thought without necessarily working towards a concrete right outcome is really valuable for mindset. So enriching extension activities is part of what we want to be thinking about. And again, anyone can access those. You're not going to stop anyone from accessing those. And the idea is that that is an opportunity for them to deepen learning, not to look busy. Ongoing assessment and data analysis is almost a data version of checking for learner understanding, and utilising technology where appropriate. Now, that will depend on how your school uses technology and what the most appropriate kind of use within your school is. But there's a whole host of technology that can help learners. I know one that is quite commonly used is if a child has very little English, kind of using translate tools in the first instance to help learners. That's a very, very extreme case and wouldn't probably fall under the bell curve of adaptive teaching. But it is certainly an adaptive strategy that you can use in that extreme case. In kind of more common cases, things like if you use an online platform for sharing resources, then can learners move through those resources at their own pace? We know that the national tests are adaptive and are kind of change depending on what learners have been asked to. So there's the opportunity to use technology as an access point for extra scaffolding, extra resources for learners, and again, kind of without having 100 bits of paper on the table. So that's just a very limited kind of way that we could use technology. There's lots of different ways that technology can be used through quizzing and things like that as well. The main thing really between adaptive teaching and differentiation is that with differentiation, it was kind of expected that a large minority of the class were not able to access the same work as the majority. So they needed something that was sort of notably different. And quite often we would then group a class, whether physically or mentally, we would group a class into different groups and they would have different activities. So you might have your ALN group, your low, middle, top, and then your very top, or your G&T or your MAT group. But with an adaptive teaching approach, there's a contrast. So really with adaptive teaching, being given different work becomes rare rather than routine. And adopting adaptive teaching as the main way of meeting a range of learning needs does not mean no learner can ever be given a different task or learning objective from other learners. This is hugely important, because adaptive teaching can sometimes be talked about in quite with quite sort of preachy tone, um, in the sense of, every learner should be able to achieve their maximum potential in with every task, and every learner should be able to access every single task. The reality of the classroom is that sometimes there will be learners who simply cannot access the same work as others, but the aim is that that is rare. And we're also here talking about we're talking about a bell curve. We're talking about the range of ability in the class. Now, at either ends of that bell curve, you may well have learners that adaptive teaching will not be enough for. And especially if you think about specific ALN needs, they may not be able to access work simply through adaptive teaching strategies alone. And in addition, it's also worth noting that depending on the subject you're teaching will depend on the amount of strategies you can use, and how kind of effective they are. So, for example, a subject like RE or history, geography, the humanities, as a cumulative subject, using adaptive teaching strategies will look very different and actually is much more achievable than in a more hierarchical subject like maths. If in maths you're working within 5, you're not going to start looking at fractions, or you're not going to start looking at long division, because you're working within those parameters and you have to have mastered those before you move on. So it's again thinking about using your professional judgment in conjunction with the best available research and the context of your learners. And thinking about those three things in conjunction is how you ultimately come up with the best decisions for your classroom. So when we think about adaptive teaching and when we think about scaffolding, it is not saying that across the board, every single child, these strategies will work. And, this is not a panacea. This is simply a range of strategies that aim to both reduce and manage teacher workload and ensure that every child has the opportunity to achieve as much as they can in a lesson. So why should we as Welsh practitioners care about adaptive teaching? Well, because among other things, it does appear in our both curriculum and teaching guidance. So as you see here, for supporting learner progression, we're talking about focusing on identifying each individual learner's strengths, achievements, areas for improvement, and where relevant barriers to learning. So that's our checking for learner understanding, really. This then includes any additional challenge and support required when planning our next steps. That's our adaptive teaching practice, and allows us then as practitioners to respond to the individual needs of the full range of learners within our classrooms on an ongoing basis. Now, this all sounds very, very perfect and wrapped up. And it needs to, as a strategic high level document, this needs to make statements like this. But from a practical perspective, we do need to remember exactly kind of the benefits of adaptive teaching, but then also the limitations. Adaptive teaching is not a miracle cure. There's always going to be a small minority of learners at either end of our bell curve that either, regardless of the amount of scaffolding we give them, they cannot access the same content as the rest of our learners in the class. And then the other end of that bell curve, learners who find learning exceptionally easy in a particular topic or subject, and regardless of the amount of extension we give them, they will always be able to, finish easily and be looking for more. So adaptive teaching is most definitely a kind of, it's a new approach in comparison to differentiation, and certainly a more improved approach in terms of mindset. But we need to remember that it is not that miracle cure, and adaptive teaching alone might not be the most appropriate response for every learner. However, the aim is that when we talk about adaptive teaching, we're talking about aiming to have the same work for the majority of learners for the majority of the time. So it's rare if you're given exceptional different work. But if learning needs do lie beyond what adaptive teaching can achieve, differentiation by task is appropriate. And a great person to look at some practical approaches to this is Claire Seeley, who uses the 4 verbs approach, which we're going to look at a bit later. But she's a great writer that explores adaptive teaching. Primary head teacher, and has contributed to, among other, lots of different research informed literature out there, and also walkthroughs as well. So lots of the things that she talks about are really useful when thinking about a very pragmatic and practical approach to adaptive teaching. And one of the key messages she has is that idea that adaptive teaching is not a miracle cure. And you can see here that, again, in our national teaching and leadership standards, so, these are mandatory, they're part of our contractual agreement as teachers. This is something that we have to be doing in order to be doing our jobs. You can see the range of different references to both differentiation and adaptive teaching here. So learning is planned, so the next stages extend learners' capacity incrementally, build upon prior knowledge. You can see that's both a curriculum and a teaching priority there. And learning materials and experiences are used to provide appropriate challenge to every learner. Seeing, mapping, reflecting upon learning. So you can see that all the different kind of ideas of adaptive teaching are embedded in both our curriculum and our teaching documentation as Welsh practitioners. So, in short, the benefits of adaptive teaching, we are increasing engagement and motivation, building self-efficacy, because learners gain confidence when they're given something that's achievable, and they're not kind of comparing work where a lower set might get different work to a higher set, etc. Research shows that it does improve academic outcomes, especially for our more vulnerable learners. It promotes inclusion and develops independent learning skills. The inclusion is kind of self-explanatory. The independent learning skills is from the idea of scaffolding and scaffolding being removed, and every child should experience their scaffolding being removed at some point. It may mean that they don't achieve as much. It may mean that they fail in a particular task, but experiencing the withdrawal of that scaffolding and then calibrating what the best pace for withdrawal is and what bits can be removed first, etc., is really valuable to develop their independent learning skills. It does enable naturally differentiated instruction, rather than kind of the sort of cynical approach to adaptive teaching, which is, we're just teaching to the middle. It allows that truly differentiated instruction. It reduces problematic behaviours. Now, again, this is not a cure-all, but it can potentially do this, because if we have that customized instruction, then those children that can get frustrated if they don't get something, will have the scaffolding to be able to do it. And then again, those off-task behaviours for those who finished, if we plan for those extensions, then and those meaningful extensions rather than busy work, then those learners can be addressed as well. And then it does inform our teaching practice, because we're constantly getting data from our learners, because we're constantly checking for that understanding. We're constantly recalibrating the pace, the challenge in our curriculum, what sorts of activities we're using to realise the learning intentions in our curriculum, and that informs our teaching practice going forward. And even just the teaching strategies that we might use and how effective they are for different learners will again inform our teaching practice, so it can be really useful as well. And all of these kind of ideas are from a website called inclusiveteach.com, which has lots of different strategies and practical applications, and some of the kind of reading behind some of these things. So that link is in the notes for you. So let's have a chat about a mental model for adaptive teaching. There's two stages really, and Megan Mansworth in her book Teach to the Top talks about this, but then lots of other documentation around adaptive teaching also talks about this this two-stage approach. And the first is planning, and at the planning stage, the sort of pre-classroom stage, and then the second is that in the moment adaptive practice. So what we ultimately want to do is we want to plan challenging content. That means that every single learner in the room is challenged. Remember, we're talking about that bell curve. If there's an absolute extreme, that's different. But that extreme is rare. We're not expecting to have people kind of for those extremes of the bell curve in every single classroom. They are rare exceptions. So our challenging learning intention in order to challenge every learner. And then we've got scaffolding that builds up to that. So every child has the opportunity to reach that learning intention. And in practice, this can work effectively. I've taught Shakespeare to children, and when I say Shakespeare, I taught Shakespeare's language to children who have reading ages of 6 and 7. And the scaffolding for that is very, very different to teaching Shakespeare's language to a CB grade GCSE class. So, but both of them at the end were able to analyze some of Shakespeare's language. So it is very possible to do. It just looks very different depending, again, on your context. And you'll find then you're able to sort of recycle some of those strategies in different tasks and in different contexts. So again, that learning curve is a stage you kind of have to go through, and then it does save a bit of time. So got our learning intention in our scaffolding, whether that be explanations, modelling, the way the lesson is designed, written scaffolds, however you want that to look. And we've got some examples of scaffolding later on. And then we also want to be thinking about all the different routes our learners can go down, and all the different ways they could approach a task. Now, sometimes tasks are quite closed and there's only one way to approach them, and that's fine. But if we're thinking about more open tasks or thinking about routes of thought or questions learners could ask, then that can be really useful, just to pre-plan and think about those things. Common misconceptions. This is such a useful and important part of planning. If we plan for addressing our common misconceptions, then we can catch so many issues before they arise. Obviously, each cohort is different. So even if you've taught something 10 times, guaranteed there will be a child who comes up with something that you haven't thought of before or you haven't experienced before. That's fine. It's about thinking about those common misconceptions. So a really common example that I tend to use is that when teaching Romeo and Juliet, most children mix up what house Romeo and Juliet are from. So the Montagues and the Capulets. And once you know that, then you know that that's something that you'll either drill, that it's something that's pre-taught, that it's something that you might quiz them on a bit more. And there will still be children who potentially forget that, but knowing that adjusts the way that you teach. So common misconceptions is hugely useful because it means that all your scaffolding can focus on much more meaningful learning, and you can just address those common misconceptions without then those misconceptions getting in the way of that scaffolding and the progress that learners can make. And then also any opportunities to link back to prior learning, any opportunities for retrieval, because again, that can be a really useful way in for learners. And if you've ever done something similar, that process of retrieval can also provide that scaffolding because they already have that mental pathway in place and they just need to revisit it with you. So if you've written a letter before and you're going to write a letter again, a little bit of retrieval practice on that actually provides a lot of the scaffolding because you've done the layout, you've done the format, you've done the language expectations, etc. So retrieval is actually providing that scaffolding by providing that mental framework for learners too. So that's our first stage. And we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail now as we go through. The second stage is the in the moment adaptations. So you will use your checks for understanding, which could be quizzes, could be questions, could be dialogue, could be a load of other things as well, could even just be the task design. But you use some method to generate a learning performance from learners. So something that they do gives you some form of data. Based on that, you then decide what you're going to do next. It could be that they've absolutely aced everything and you're going to zip through the next load of stuff. If they've got 100 exercises to work through and after 15 you've realised, oh yeah, they've absolutely got this, maybe you would stop them at 20 and then hold the others for a quick bit of retrieval in a couple of lessons' time. If they really haven't got it, and there's some fundamental misconceptions, and that may just be a small group of learners in the class, you might hold some sort of intervention where everyone else can carry on, and you move those 5 or 6 learners and you work with them for 10 minutes and just give them a little bit of an alternative explanation, or you just provide them with some direct instruction about where to go next. And again, that's okay. And that's also okay to do. I think in primary, practitioners are much more comfortable with that idea of the flexible movements. I think in secondary, because children are bigger and moving tends to cause more fuss. I think because learners just aren't that used to it. I think that it's just used less. But actually, that flexible grouping approach of, okay, you guys come over for 10 minutes, let's have a chat, let's do this, and then you can go and sit back down, can be hugely valuable and actually quite efficient. It doesn't need to be all singing or dancing. It can be just a short, sharp intervention and then moving on. Or it might be the case that you need to recap everything and with everyone and go through it in maybe a slightly different way. What you might find is that everyone's got some sort of misunderstanding or hasn't performed as well as you would like, but even within that you're going to have a range. So you might have some that really don't get it and you might have some that nearly get it. And again, it's about then strategically using those people and strategically using your learners to benefit as much as they can from each other. So the ones that really don't get it might benefit from taking a really active role in the reteach, whatever that process might be. If it was an experiment, for example, they could help conduct the experiment. If appropriate, you might find that you want them to just focus on the learning and, therefore not be panicking about holding lit splints or chemicals or something. But at the same time, if they're involved, then they have to be paying attention in a way that they don't have to be if they're watching, because they can just theoretically drift off. Or you could be regularly asking them questions, or you could be getting them to deliver the instructions. And then those that really do get it, perhaps could model the instructions, while those ones that kind of don't get it are taking part in that practical experiment. You could be getting them to ask questions as they go through. You could be getting them to address questions to the group as they go through. There's so many different ways of using learners as resources for each other. I know that's a Dylan William formative assessment point, but using them as learning resources for each other is really valuable. And contrary to popular belief, it doesn't affect our stronger learners as negatively as people think. Using learners as resources for each other isn't about just using those stronger learners as TAs. It's not that approach at all. It's about thinking about who you've got in the room, what abilities you have, where people are at in terms of their understanding, and then distributing the tasks and the process among them. So that's our mental model for adaptive teaching, and we'll have a look now at each kind of stage in turn. So our two-step process, thinking about our planning and then also thinking about our in the moment adaptations. We're going to focus first on our does challenge look like? How can we calibrate challenge to ensure that the vast majority of our learners are being challenged on a regular basis? And how do we know that we're pitching most appropriately? So we're going to have a look at this idea of challenge because this sets the tone for the rest of our adaptive teaching. Because when we're talking about adaptive teaching, what we're talking about is scaffolding so that every learner can reach an area of high aspiration and challenge for them. So we need to ensure that that challenge is there. So a few misconceptions. Challenge equals difficult content. That is true. So challenge can equal difficult content, but also challenge can be seen in other forms as well. And actually, more straightforward content can still be challenging. It's not the only method of making something more difficult. So picking difficult stuff to teach isn't the only way that we can generate challenge. Challenge doesn't necessarily always mean more work as well. Quite often we conflate being busy with learning stuff, and actually that is not necessarily true. So thinking about challenge, sometimes deep thinking, sometimes working through very little, but working through it at a very deep level can present real challenge. So more work isn't necessarily always more challenge. Challenge equals independence. Again, this can be challenge, but not in isolation. So just because a child is working through something independently, it doesn't mean that they're necessarily being challenged. Because they may find it really straightforward and therefore they're not being challenged. Equally, if a child has someone helping them or has scaffolding or has that instruction, they are actually able to address even more challenging work because they're having that step-by-step instruction. Now, what we want to do is potentially aim to move towards independence, but just giving someone something to complete independently from the off isn't necessarily a challenge and isn't necessarily the best way to go about every single task, because actually, in order for learners to address things beyond what they're currently capable of, they are going to need some input from you as a teacher, and they're going to need some input and instruction and guidance to be able to embed those ideas cognitively in order to then do them themselves at a later date. So independence is a journey. Challenge doesn't necessarily always equal independence. They might be on that journey to independence. Challenge doesn't always necessarily mean academic as well. If you think about, some children are hugely academic but really struggle socially. So the challenge for them would be that social struggle. A really pertinent example is that if you teach any subject that has an oral exam, then you will know the struggles of trying to get children to be recorded for presentations, conversations, discussions. The level of challenge for some incredibly bright learners is hugely difficult, because of the challenge around the sort of the stigma around being recorded and the fear of making a mistake and all those things. Now, that isn't an academic challenge. In actual fact, it's probably one of the more straightforward parts of what they're doing, but because of the things around it, the format of the task, then that challenge is there. So, thinking about the concept of challenge holistically for your learners, and not only just academic content or knowledge, but thinking about some of those wider skills that they might need. And that's where things like the integral skills can be really useful to have a look at. And challenge doesn't always have to be stressful. I know the example I just gave with the oracy exams is quite stressful, but challenge does not always have to be stressful. Challenge can be calm, contemplative. Challenge can be fun. So when we think about challenge, we want to kind of think about it a little bit more holistically. So there are different aspects of challenge, and they can be looked at in kind of, say, 4 different ways. And this again comes from Claire Seeley and how she defines kind of the ways that she would scaffold in her classroom. So it and ultimately calibrating these 4 things is how you create your challenge. So task quantity, juggling lots of things. A good example of this would be if you are trying to write in role about something. So let's imagine that you are writing a letter to someone and you are on the first voyage of the Titanic. So you have to have knowledge of the Titanic, you have to be able to write a letter, you have to be able to write in role, you have to be able to write grammatically correctly. There's a huge amount of different things to juggle there cognitively, right? So that means the challenge is quite high. Then you've got the intrinsic demands of content. So you've got concrete to abstract. Now, if I was, a good example of this would be in mathematics. If you're teaching using manipulatives, then number is concrete. As soon as you remove those and start doing mental maths, number becomes abstract, and therefore it's cognitively more demanding. Now, there's lots of other things that you could explore here. If you're talking about how much money you've got in your bank, that's a fairly concrete thing. But if you're talking about social deprivation, then that's a bit more of an abstract concept for learners to get their heads around. So there's the intrinsic demands of the content is going to depend on what you're teaching in terms of your curriculum, qualifications, etc. And there are ways that you can make abstract concepts concrete. Manipulatives is a good example. Graphic organizers for things, like diagrams. If you're reading a book, diagrams to show relationships between characters and things like that. But ultimately, that's going to depend on your curriculum. Then you've got how much the learner knows. Are they a novice, or is this brand new to them? Because if it is, everything is going to be more cognitively demanding. No matter how simple it is, everything will be more cognitively demanding. And then, if they're expert, if they've been doing it for a while, if they're revisiting it, then it's going to be a little bit more straightforward. And again, we need to think beyond the academic for some of these things too, especially if we're thinking about foundation learning, because actually there's a huge amount of cognitive skill, but also gross motor skill, fine motor skill, for example, that learners are still working on. And therefore they're not expert in those things, and therefore they're not automatic in those things, so things take a bit more time. So a learner writing their name, they need to be able to know their letter formation, and they need to be able to grip their pen, and those things are far more challenging for learners of that age and stage than learners who've been practicing and doing that for a while. Also, there's learners who are able to then write their name but can't write anything else because they've got their name to the point where it's automatic, and to the point where they're not even letters anymore, they're just sort of their name. But then they need to start learning about letter formation, for other words. And in order to do that, they need to understand how words are formed, and then they need to become expert in their phonics. And so there's so many layers, especially in foundation learning, that where learners are, it can't be assumed that they're expert. And that, to be honest, that mentality extends right up to, you know, um, our 16 and post 16 learners, because we can't assume that they're expert in things. We can't assume that they know how to structure paragraphs, even if they've been taught it. We can't always assume that. So again, this is where our checking for understanding is really useful, because then we can calibrate this based on how expert our learners are. And then finally, how much external support is provided. So once we've calibrated these top three, we can kind of adjust this bottom one with scaffolding to adjust it to the level of challenge that we want. Now, the aim isn't to have it where everything is right at the top, because we're going to lose learners. That's too challenging. And this is what we mean about calibrating challenge. You can see, for example, here we've got it where there's quite a lot to think about in this particular lesson. The concepts are fairly abstract. Maybe we've got a little bit of a concrete thing to start off, but then we're fairly abstract. There's also minimal scaffolding. So this feels pretty challenging. But actually, it's because our learners are expert in this. And because they're expert in this, we can raise the challenge of these other bits. Whereas if our learners weren't so expert in this, then we might provide a bit more scaffolding. We could still even do the same kind of challenging content if we wanted. But here we might provide a lot of scaffolding in the first instance. And then reduce that quickly as time goes on. Or we might find that there's that we're not going to give that much scaffolding, because even though our learners aren't really expert in this, it's fairly concrete and there's not that much to think about, so we don't need to provide as much scaffolding. So it's about calibrating it to the point where learners are in that kind of productive struggle zone, where they're feeling challenged, but they're also feeling like they're achieving something. So when we're thinking about these, there's different ways that we can actually address these to calibrate that challenge. So we want to reduce our memory demands, and therefore reduce the number of things learners have to think about at the same time. Anticipate memory demands, and that's all about curriculum design really. Support memory demands by scaffolding, and then strengthen our memory as well. And that's through our culture of retrieval. So again, there's a bit of curriculum link here. But within our teaching practice, we want to be using our retrieval practice as much as possible, so that we can ensure that learners are strengthening those pathways. So here we are. We've got the 4 of them here. And you can see that this has a very sort of a kind of a cognitive science framework around it, I suppose. And that's Claire Seeley's approach. There's another approach that we'll be looking at a bit later on that focuses more on the scaffolding aspect of this. But this is quite a useful way to think about adaptive teaching holistically, and in particular to think about how we're calibrating our challenge, and thinking about if a child is struggling, is it, which one of these things is out of sync? Because actually it can be a really useful diagnostic tool to think, okay, does has a child perhaps been absent for a few lessons, and therefore they haven't had the sequenced curriculum that that means that they can access the work at ease in that lesson. Maybe they have a lower kind of cognitive capacity than others, just in terms of being overwhelmed and having cognitive overwhelm and overload. So is there something that we can do to reduce those tasks with something like a task list, or some method of chunking, and so on. So using this as a diagnostic tool as to why learners are struggling in a lesson can be really useful as well. So let's have a look at these in a bit more detail. The first one, to reduce memory demand. We want our clear, succinct explanations, chunking, and we want to ensure that learners are understanding. So again, checking for understanding. So here As an example, I've put down the word current for key terms because the word current means very different things in geography, in science, and in food tech. So learners can, if they don't have that key vocabulary, can get lost in those lessons because in their heads they've got a very strange picture of a river flowing with lots of dried fruit in it. And that is something that that we have experienced more than once, multiple times, of learners, not just with that word, but with other words where just quick clarification of those key terms, those key messages can make the world of difference in terms of learner understanding and therefore motivation. Clear, legible, uncluttered visual information. This is thinking about the basics of cognitive load here. If we don't need 6 GIFs on the slide, let's not put 6 GIFs on the slide. And just thinking about how we convey those key messages. Doesn't mean you can never share a GIF with learners. We're not necessarily saying that. But we need to think about when we're giving our key messages, what do we want them focusing on? And giving learners permanent access to key information. That's where knowledge organisers had their day. Knowledge organisers are still used really successfully in some schools, not so much in others. It depends on how they're implemented and whether they're actually used as to whether they're useful. But permanent access to key information can be really useful. And another way of kind of looking at something like a knowledge organizer, but without doing the printing and all the stuff beforehand, is creating relationship and concept maps for topics as kind of opening pages. So as key terms, as key messages are introduced throughout the topic, you can add them to that concept map and link them up to show how they have a relationship, how they're connected. And that again can reinforce learning and be really useful. And serve it's not quite the same function, but a similar sort of function to a knowledge organizer. But obviously, learners are building up the knowledge over time, so the process of developing it is quite different. Okay, so our next one is anticipating memory demand. So this is all about curriculum design. We want to design a curriculum that builds on that previous knowledge, but also that accounts for forgetting. Forgetting is not a bad thing. Forgetting is simply part of learning. So we want to design a curriculum that builds on our previous knowledge and allows that forgetting process to take place and then for that conscious remembering to happen. Because if we do that, then we're strengthening those memory pathways. And we also want to know what comes before and after the current learning to reinforce, embed, and anticipate learning. So as a teacher, if you are teaching a particular topic, it's really useful to know what those learners have done before and know what those learners are coming up against next. Now, you might be their only teacher, so that's going to be really straightforward. If you're not, then having a look at some of the wider curriculum documents, even just having a conversation with learners can be really valuable to look at where you can draw those connections. And that's within subjects, but also across subjects as well, which we know embodies kind of the vision of curriculum for Wales. And doing it in a meaningful way can really, again, strengthen those memory pathways. And then supporting memory demand. So we want to here think about some of our scaffolding. And these are some ways that you can scaffold without necessarily creating loads and loads and loads of paperwork for yourself and loads of paper resources. So it could be things like matching or sorting because you're having to critically think about the information in front of you. And it's about actively engaging with the information in front of you. Graphic organizers are hugely useful because they organize the information, which can then be sort of mapped into your head, and those relationships can also kind of be internalized as well as the information there. Word banks, so pre-teaching for word banks, fixing the errors. Again, it depends on what stage learners are at. Novices are not going to be able to fix errors, so there's no point in doing that then, but as they become more expert, fixing errors is a great exercise to check understanding. Completing a fragment. This could be a sentence, but it could be an image. It could be a map. It could be like a flow chart or process. It entirely depends on what you're teaching an age and stage. Sentence starters or structure strips. I'm a big fan of structure strips for more extended writing tasks, because partly because they're quite efficient in that you can print them out and use less paper, but they just stick in the margin of your book, and then they just provide that little bit of a framework for learners, but then they're still writing in their book. So it's kind of a more natural kind of scaffold that can be removed that little bit more easily, because they're used to writing in the lines in their book, and you can again design it so that you're showing them how much of their book you want them to use and write on for different bits. And again, they're really flexible too. So you could include key vocabulary in some, you could include sentence starters, you could just include some key questions you want them to think about in different sections. And they're really quick to create as well. And I find that as a writing frame, they're not as obtrusive, but but actually just as impactful as kind of a full page writing frame. And then sentence combining as well. So thinking about using vocabulary to explore the relationship between information in different sentences can be really valuable in demonstrating knowledge as well. Things like cause and effect, or opposition, things like that. And then the last one is to strengthen memory. So here, this is about kind of thinking about our retrieval practice ultimately. We all know kind of Kate Jones is the queen of retrieval practice, and she's got a number of books out that are really practical and have just a lot of different practical strategies and different formats in which to conduct successful retrieval. And she's also got free resources online as well. But retrieval grids in whatever format you want to do those, things like picture prompts, practice pyramids, correcting the errors. There's hundreds of different ways of doing this. And the key here isn't the activity choice, but it's that long-term planning for retrieval and application of prior knowledge in increasingly sophisticated contexts. So thinking about ways that you can strengthen that memory is hugely important. And again, something to note as well is that strengthening memory, or indeed any of those challenges, aspects of challenge, can include intervention or discrete tasking as well. We need to remember that. So I know that I've talked quite a bit, and if you're watching this as a video, then you've probably paused at different points to have a look at some of these strategies, or just to give yourself a break. But I'm going to give you a few minutes now. So again, just pause the video when you're ready and think about which strategies you already use, because I would imagine that you use quite a few of the ones that we've talked about. Which ones do you use but perhaps could refine, or at least think about more consciously through the lens of adaptive teaching? And if there are any that are new, could you introduce any of them? So think about any of the opportunities or barriers you might have when implementing these, because again, we need to be thinking about that three-pronged approach to evidence-informed practice: the best available research, our knowledge as education professionals, and the context of our class and our school. So think about any of the opportunities or barriers you may have, and if there's any way that you could reduce those barriers and what you might need to make that happen. So I'll give you a few minutes to pause now. All right, so now we've reflected on that, we're going to have a look at the second part of the model, and that is the in the moment adaptive practice. So just to very quickly jog our memory, we are looking at using our checks for understanding, and there's many different ways that we can do that, and then making our adjustments, whatever they may be, and using our professional judgment to do so. So let's have a look at both of those stages. First of all, we it honestly doesn't matter what you kind of what you choose. Obviously, I would question as to why perhaps you would choose a dance in maths or science, and why you would choose an experiment in um, in drama. I don't know, but thinking about kind of what is appropriate for your age, stage, and domain of learning that you're looking at. And it really can be anything, but the key is it makes the learning visible for the teacher and highlights errors in relation to the learning intention, or highlights competence and whether we can move on. So the key thing here is purpose. That is the most important thing. You should really be able to justify why you've used that particular approach. It could be efficiency. It could be because you needed to test skill or knowledge in context. It could be because you needed them to take something they've just learned and combine it with things that they've learned previously. It could be that you need to see how they work individually compared to in a group. It really doesn't matter. What is key is that you know the purpose, and that purpose serves your knowledge and understanding of where they're going next. So again, just going to give you a few minutes to pause the video and to reflect. So again, what strategies do you use? Which ones do you use, but could you refine? So for example, do you use questioning, but perhaps haven't used multiple choice questions in this particular way before? And are there any new strategies? Just thinking about some of those checking for understanding strategies, are there any new ones that you could try or introduce? And again, considering the opportunities and barriers you have. So just a few minutes on that. So I mentioned earlier that we were looking at Claire Seeley's cognitive approach to, or quite cognitive approach to pitching and pitching for challenge and scaffolding around that. So I want to introduce another approach now. This one has been developed by Alex Quigley, but has been mentioned by quite a lot of people as well. And this one talks largely around adaptive practice and sort of adapting in the moment. So this idea of recalibrating, scaffolding for success, and that is the 4 S's approach, or the 4 S's of adaptive practice. So these are structure, style, scaffolds, and scale. So we'll go through each of these in turn, but each of these are ways that you can scaffold. And again, you'll see that there's some real correlation with Claire Seeley's approach. There isn't one kind of better approach than the other. Claire Seeley's does work quite well when diagnosing learners and thinking about pitching for challenge initially, but honestly, you could use either one and just interchange it. It just depends on what works best for you. So the first one here is structure. We want to think about how we're going to support structuring things, and that ultimately is taking some of the cognitive demand away from learners, because they have the framework and they just need to populate it. That's where we can have task maps or frames. We can have writing frames for specific writing purposes, such as, because it doesn't just have to be genre writing, it could be things like an essay evaluation. And again, a writing frame doesn't have to be a full page. It could be a little structure strip. It could be a little set of bullet points, however you want to set it out. Or it could be then things like parts of a science experiment and how that's laid out. You could include in that sentence starters, which come up as a different kind of scaffold later on. But we're thinking at the moment purely about that idea of structure, how we are structuring a some sort of task and some sort of piece of work. So there's just, again, some different ideas there. The next one is style. So things like using different art media. If you've got someone who's who's really really proficient in art, then they could be using mixed media, or they might use more challenging media. Like, for example, if they're really comfortable with the way that watercolor paint behaves, and how it interacts with other media, then they could be introducing that. Whereas others who might not be as comfortable with that and be able to manipulate the media to suit them might stick with pencil. Could be different writing styles. And again, you can provide scaffolding through imitating an author versus finding your own voice. You can even take them through that process by highlighting some key sentence structures, key phrases that author uses, and use that as some sort of scaffold. And this can include a different mode of output. Not always, but it can, and that's okay. Um, we can include kind of ways that children can complete a task in a different fashion and produce something different to their peers. And it's up to you as to whether, again, you give them a sort of short list of options, whether you give them complete free reign. That's going to depend on age, stage, kind of children that you're working with. The next S to cover is scaffolds. Now, this category tends to cover everything that the others don't. So this can include sentence starters, word banks, templates. This could be like a face with guidelines on it. So anything that doesn't fit neatly into the other categories tends to go here. Scaffolds can be task lists, can be conversation starters, can be use of a TA. There's so many different, again, ways that you can scaffold, and again, not all of them are written. And there's lots of there's one-page guides to the 4S's that are kind of freely available through Alex Quigley, and there's lots more examples on there. These are kind of the highlights, really. But what this is hopefully showing you is that a huge amount of this you're already doing. So again, it's just thinking about it consciously and thinking about it as perhaps as part of this larger framework of the 4S's, or Claire Seeley's approach, and thinking about those the 4 different cognitive demands. So thinking about different ways that you can approach a task and different ways that you can scaffold can be really beneficial. The last one here is scale. So increasing or decreasing the length or scale of a task. This could be something like writing length. This could be an amount of mathematics problems, but busy or volume doesn't always mean more challenge. Remember that. So busyness is often a poor proxy for learning. Something that I've seen quite effectively in something like maths, where a lot of the conversation is, oh, you can't differentiate in maths. One way that you can is if you've got 20 problems, you do your check for understanding, you see where learners are, and rather than giving them different finishing points, you give them different starting points. So some learners might need a little bit more practice on some of the more basic sums before they move up to some of the more challenging equations, but others might not need that. So you might tell some learners to start at number 1, and tell some learners to start at number 5, and tell some learners to start at number 7, but all of them have to do between 10 and 14. So for some of them, 10 and 14 might be the most difficult ones they do. That doesn't mean they have to stop there. They could carry on and do more of the sums, but 10 and 14 might be the most difficult ones they do. For some of them, it might be the middle of what they do, and for some, it might be some of the easier end of what they do. But that task hasn't changed. It's the same list of equations, the same list of questions. It's just using it in that adaptive way so that everyone has the chance to approach the challenge with the appropriate scaffolding. And in that case, the scaffolding is an increase in the scale of the task because they're having more practice. So a decrease in the scale of the task doesn't necessarily mean um, that it's easier. Um, and I think that's kind of it's worth thinking about increase and decrease in both a supportive and a challenge kind of context. So there's a few different ways that you can kind of look at that as well. So they're the four S's: structure, style, scaffolds, and scale. And now you've had a look at those, I'll give you another opportunity to reflect. So again, pause the video just for a few minutes. What do you use already? What could you refine? Is there anything new you could introduce? And consider any opportunities and barriers you may have. All right. So we've been through a couple of different frameworks that you can use when considering adaptive teaching practice, looked at a few practical strategies, and hopefully explored some of the misconceptions and the rationale behind adaptive teaching as a positive teaching approach. Just some key takeaways. The key thing with adaptive teaching is micro adaptations. We're not looking to completely change the face of our teaching. We're looking at doing very small things in our classrooms that can make a difference, whether that is just slightly changing the way that we explain something, whether that is using our checks for understanding a bit more consciously. It doesn't have to be massive, and it shouldn't be massive, because adaptive teaching shouldn't be accounting for a major increase in workload. It doesn't always have to be written. So hopefully we've shown a whole range of different ways that you could adapt in the moment, as well as adapt during planning, to kind of show that flexibility in your teaching. And it doesn't always have to be written down, because we know that there is that strong association with written resources and an increase in workload. And once that habit starts, it's very difficult to stop kind of producing those sorts of resources, and then you find yourself stuck kind of with that increase in workload. So we don't need everything to be written. Sometimes a written scaffold is most appropriate, but not always. And it's always worth kind of trying different things as well. This is not an exact science. It's a lot of trial and error, and it's a lot of working with the children in front of you, and seeing what works for them. And finally, there are exceptions. We need to remember that this is not a magic cure. This is a bell curve that we're dealing with in our classrooms, and there will be extremes at either ends of that. Something that is often asked when we talk about adaptive teaching is the debate about around mixed ability classes. Now, there is a huge wealth of research out there that that kind of explores the pros and the cons of mixed ability teaching. We know that the research tends to land on the side of mixed ability teaching benefiting learners, in particular our vulnerable learners. And when we look at some of the benefits, lots of the benefits that we see with our more vulnerable learners tends to be kind of the things that we see as a result of some of these adaptive teaching practices, because in order to teach a mixed ability class effectively, you have to do some of these things, and probably naturally do already. That increased confidence, that kind of knowledge that they're accessing the same work as some of the in inverted commas kind of cleverer children. Um, so we know that it does have that impact. Whether your school chooses to engage in mixed ability classes or not, is a school level decision. But what I would say is that even if your classes are streamed or set, it is worth remembering that within a set or stream, even if every child is, for example, predicted the same level grade at the end of the year, if we take a GCSE class as an example, just because it's quite easy to articulate that, if every child is predicted to get a B at the end of the year, you'll have some children who will be able to get that easily, and some children who are working very hard to be working at that level, you'll still have a range of ability in the room. It might not be as wide a range as a mixed ability classroom, but there will still be a range, and therefore this adaptive teaching still needs to be something that needs to be taken into consideration. Again, some subjects can adapt very well to mixed ability teaching. Some perhaps find it a little bit more challenging. So again, it's a school level decision, but there is a wealth of research, and the Education Endowment Foundation is a good starting point. Although what I would say is that it is an area of research that is quite contentious, in that there's an awful lot of information out there that strongly argues for both sides. So again, going back to being an evidence informed practitioner, we need to read the best available research. We need to look at the classes and the context that we have, and we need to use our professional judgment as educational professionals to decide what is best for our learners. But ultimately, the main message to go away with today is with an eye on our learners being, many of them being more vulnerable than they ever have been before, but also with teachers being vulnerable with workload, among many other things. We want to aim for different work to be a rarity rather than the norm. We want that so that our learners feel included in the learning conversation, and we want it so that teachers don't feel overwhelmed with the amount of work that they have to put in to make a lesson work for their learners. So we want to aim for different work to be a rarity rather than the norm. And this concludes today's session on adaptive teaching. Thank you so much for joining me and talking through all of the processes around adaptive teaching, some of the strategies, the rationale, and hopefully you've had a chance to reflect and think about some of the adaptations you can make in your classroom, or some of the things that you're doing already that are already making a difference to our learners. If you want any further support, if you have any questions or any comments, then please don't hesitate to contact the team, and we will get in touch with you and talk about your specific context and your needs. That is it from me. Again, thank you so much for joining me, and for watching this recording. And this will be available to look at and to revisit at your leisure. So thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr, and have a good rest of your day. Goodbye.